Now, as the contentious negotiations for a preferred governing structure proceed, the fate of South Africa's poorest citizens is notably absent from the discussions. Now, this is the view of Professor Stephen Chan from the School of Oriental and African Studies Faculty of Law and Social Sciences, who joins us this evening to unpack his views. Good evening, Professor, and thank you very much for your time. So you wrote a very interesting article, having chosen to view this year's elections from the lens of the poorest of the poor. Talks are ongoing on the most ideal governing structure, and you say at this point the conversation is less about which governing structure would have a more positive impact on the poor, and they're more about leadership positions of power. Just talk us through this.
I think what you've got in South Africa now is a fundamental disconnect between those who are in positions of power, those who are in positions of influence, and those at the bottom of the heap. During the election campaign, I spent quite a lot of time in some of the poorer suburbs of Johannesburg, in Kliptown, Soweto, Tembisa, and in Alexandra. And all the people I talked to said they weren't going to vote. And I asked them why. And they said, no one cares. The government doesn't care. No one has done anything for us. And I believed them, because every time I come to South Africa, I go down to these areas. I've even done voluntary work in Kliptown on a regular basis in the past. And every time I come, the conditions of ordinary people get worse. Now, there's a big question here. If you don't do something for your people, why should they vote for you? Mm-hmm. And that's what I'm concerned about. And these negotiations, which are necessary right now, is very much about the disposition and the division of power. I have not yet heard mentioned any significant program of amelioration and uplift for the people in the poorest areas of South Africa.
Mm-hmm. What of those that might say, those on the far right, such as your economic freedom fighters, the PAC, even now with the emergence of MK, are the very political parties that would ensure that the voice of the poor finds expression at the negotiating table?
They can say that. They won't do it, because what you've got, particularly in the part of the economic freedom fighters and the MK, are very, very crude recipes for nationalization. Now, all this does is to concentrate even more power, in this case, greater economic power, in the hands of a power elite. And once again, you've got instruments of distribution of resources removed one step further from the poorer areas. In other words, what you've got here on the part of the so-called radical parties is, if I might put it boldly, a very crude Marxism, which is now, in this day and age of modernity, electronic processes, completely out of date. And of course, that's why many of them protested the results of the election, because they couldn't understand the electronic processes. You've actually got, and this applies to the ANC as well, until very recently, a large number of members of the cabinet couldn't use their own email. Everyone thought history stopped in 1990 and 1994. History didn't stop. History continued. And there are so many politicians on all sides, left and right, including the EFF and the MK, who've got no idea what the modern age demands.
Mm-hmm. So what picture should a governing structure take right now, or what form? Because if you seem to be of the view that the far right or the far left are all outdated or won't really represent the ordinary citizens or the poor, what is needed here? Is it a centrist government?
Basically, some kind of government that can find middle ground. Now, this may be very, very difficult. You're not going to get any kind of power sharing or unity government with an absolutely equal distribution of powers. To keep it clean, to keep it functional, to keep it, as it were, cooperative, there's going to have to be a clear delineation of duties. Now, some people have talked about the ANC dominating the executive and perhaps the DA dominating the legislature. This is something which might work, and everyone has got, as it were, a sphere of influence. It won't be perfect. It does mean the possibility of some form of cooperation, some kind of coherence. This has happened in France before, for instance. They call it cohabitation. And mature people can find a way of doing these things. In other words, there's got to grow beyond sound bites into actual discussions about coherence of government, not just national unity, but coherence within that national unity.
So you're more in favor of that model, the so-called supply and confidence that the ANC had proposed, that they keep or retain all the executive positions and that the Democratic Alliance is in the legislature. Some are saying that, just like you, this would be ideal because it would inoculate or protect the Democratic Alliance from any governance failures should the ANC not do well.
It would do that, but 2029 and being able to use your advantages during this term is still a long way off. People have got to perform in this term, and performance does require cooperation. You can't say I'm insulated, that wasn't my fault, because if the DA, for instance, as we've been discussing, controls the legislature, this also means that it will have the lion's share of chairmanships of parliamentary committees, which liaise directly with the ministerial portfolios in the executive. There's not going to be a clean quarantine. There's going to have to be some form of mature, adult cooperation to ensure coherent government, to try to start delivering those things that have been lacking in terms of the citizen body.
Let's hope we do see that maturity. But just before I let you go, Professor, I want to get your views on what we're seeing in Europe currently. We know that Emmanuel Macron has called for a snap election, and this is post the European parliamentary elections. Just talk us through your views, because here we're seeing that far-right shift, though modest if you look practically at the numbers, but significant to the point where France decided to take this kind of a decision.
Macron is very, very much a kind of politician who sees himself, and often is, quite decisive. So he acted immediately, whereas his counterpart, Chancellor Schulz in Germany, has decided not to call a snap election. And although the European parliamentary elections suggested a turn to the right, this is not reflected throughout the entire continent. Although Britain is not yet part of Europe again, we're having elections next month. It's almost certain that there's going to be a turn to the left. So it's difficult to read entirely from one set of elections into the national picture in all countries that make up the European project. Very interesting times, of course, for Europe, and certainly very, very interesting times for us all here in the United Kingdom.
Indeed, they are. Professor, thank you very much for joining us this evening. That's Professor Stephen Chan from the School of Oriental and African Studies Faculty of Law and Social Sciences.